Well, I'm super excited to have you back on the podcast today. Basically, we're bringing Bryan back on because we have new training cycles starting super soon at Paragon. Majority of the time, we are living in hypertrophy. We're getting all the muscle building goodness, but we are back to a strength cycle. And so, one of our first episodes was actually our most downloaded episode still to date. And it was with Bryan, and basically we were breaking down the difference between hypertrophy and then strength training or being a strength cycle. So today we're going to kind of get back into it, and we tried to go into some different questions that we didn't cover the first time around. We've had a lot of really good, awesome questions just on social media or in the Paragon group. Bryan, do you want to kind of get into just a little reminder on the difference between hypertrophy training versus strength training?
Yeah, for sure. So, strength training, the main thing you're going to see is that we're going to just be training in lower rep ranges. That's the big obvious thing. So, when you look at hypertrophy, you generally see between 6 and 15, 6 and 20, something like that, as far as rep range goes. For strength, you generally see 1 to 6. And then you start getting above 6 and you start getting into more of that hypertrophy spectrum. Strength is a neurological skill. We are going to cover, I think, some of the recent research that just came out on proximity to failure. And one of the things that we're going to elucidate in this discussion around proximity to failure is how strength is actually benefited being further from failure, and hypertrophy is benefited the closer you get to failure, or even beyond failure, according to this new meta regression that just came out. And so that's one big thing that I think is probably misunderstood about strength phases is people think, oh, big heavy weights, 1 rep maxes, powerlifting competition. And what they see is the powerlifting competition. They see the 1 rep maxes that are occurring in the sport itself on the biggest stages. What they don't see is the hours and hours and hours of training leading up to that are done at significantly submaximal loading to just hammer technique and execution and create that kind of neurological profile that allows you to be skillful at your lift. And a lot of that skill is mitigated when you do get close to failure because you're grinding reps, you're compensating with other muscle groups that you're not anticipating and things like that. And so the message can get blurred when that occurs. But I would say that those are probably the two biggest distinctions would be the rep range being lower and generally working a little bit further from failure.
Do you want to get into, so we have a 7-week strength cycle coming up, and then it'll be followed up by a 6-week metabolic hypertrophy cycle. So do you want to kind of talk about what you did differently and also like where those ideas came from and stuff like that?
When you actually look at the strength portion of this cycle, it's not so different from what we've done in prior cycles in that we're using like a really cool linear periodization model that's going to start at about 6 reps. And then each week we will drop reps, add volume where it's applicable. And then in the final week, in week 7, we'll essentially be ready to test 1 rep maxes. This time, given that this is a 7-week strength cycle, we're actually doing something that is really unique to Paragon programming, but it's called a taper week. That basically means that we're going to spend 1 week right before the testing week, where we're going to do significantly less volume. And with volume being the number one thing correlated to fatigue, and with the knowledge that we know that fatigue masks fitness, meaning if you're fatigued, you won't be able to lift the heaviest weights possible. We institute this taper week with lower volumes. We flush fatigue, but we keep skill high. So maybe instead of hitting, say, what we would usually do the prior week would say be 4 sets of 2 might be what we would do. We'll probably in this taper week, I haven't officially decided yet, but it's likely we'll just work up to 1 set of 1, and it'll be at say 90% of what you want to hit on your 1 rep max day. But it's not going to be like we're doing multiple sets of 1 or trying to cause a bunch of fatigue. We want to just get in, hit that single, build confidence. And then the next week we'll have essentially not only have the confidence to hit the heavier weight, but we may actually exceed our own expectations because we'll have less fatigue going into that as well. So that's a huge difference in this cycle, given that it's 7 weeks instead of 6 weeks compared to prior cycles. And I'm really excited to see how that change goes across and how many awesome PRs we see. And then we also have the change of including hypertrophy swaps. So if we want to dig into that, or if you guys have any questions on the first part.
Get into it, because like that's basically what's really cool about this cycle is we always have the same issue where it'll be like, well, I'm about strength, but right now I actually am planning to start a diet or I'm dieting right now. And so it's just not the most optimal time to also be like, hi, I'm gonna like lift the most and rip all these heavy weights. And so we always were mitigating this like, okay, well, we're on a strength cycle, so you're writing brand new programming for that. But then you're also having to write a hypertrophy cycle so that we have an option for those people that are dieting. So kind of get into basically when you're looking at the programming, the layout of it, because it really is choose your own adventure and it's all under the same program rather than in the app. It'd be like, well, click here for the strength cycle or click here for the hypertrophy cycle.
This time, essentially what we've done is we've provided two different rep paths and then two different sequences of movement swaps that you could choose from. Basically, the idea being that if you look at our first movement of the day, which is a low bar back squat, if you're following the strength cycle, it'll say other movements you can swap for the strength, other strength movements you can swap. And the only swap listed is high bar, barbell, back squat. And then it'll say alternative hypertrophy movements that you can swap. And then it'll have things like leg press, hack squat, pendulum squat, heels elevated, pause back squat, or foam roller, dumbbell hack squats. So we'll have 4 or 5 different like hypertrophy swaps. And the reason that it's really important to separate these into buckets and have these as hypertrophy specific swaps is because you're never going to build to a 1 rep max on any of those movements. You would never see anybody in a commercial gym being like, I'm going to load up this leg press or this hack squat, and I'm going to see how much weight I can do for 1
Hey, I did that in high school,
rep.
though. For real, though. We did it. We did it in high school.
Yeah. It's just not that smart. And you also, by the same token, you wouldn't do the same thing with a dumbbell foam roller hack squat. Like, let me see what the heaviest dumbbells are that I can get to the bottom and stand up with.
Sounds like a disaster.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I think that given that, each like the strength progression we kind of alluded to earlier is this kind of descending rep scheme 6, 5, 4, 3, 2 taper 1 approach. And then in the hypertrophy, it'll just be what you would expect generally from hypertrophy style rep ranges. So 6 to 12 reps along those lines. One of the things that Laura and I had been discussing is the idea of movement monotony. And this is, when we're in our hypertrophy cycles, we don't generally even provide an option for someone to choose a conventional deadlift, sumo deadlift, low bar back squat, stuff like that. It's literally like, hey, we're in a hypertrophy cycle. You should choose the most optimal hypertrophy movement. If you go into the strength cycle and you continue to select an RDL and a hack squat as your primary movements, that's fine. But you should be aware that those movements aren't going to change. You're then going to go into the next cycle and perform the same movements again, and then the next cycle again, and then another strength cycle will come around. And essentially you have no reprieve from those movements. Those are just your movements, right? So Laura and I were talking about how we kind of feel like there really should be some consideration on your part embarking on this cycle of even using the designated strength movement, like the low bar back squat or the conventional deadlift, and just do them in the hypertrophy rep range. If you're really against strength work, there's no reason you can't choose the strength movement and just do it in hypertrophy rep ranges. And no, a low bar back squat is not going to be the most optimal movement to grow your quads as big as possible. But it does have a ton of tangential benefits like increasing strength in your midline, glutes, working your body in coordination, in unison. And all of these things are going to transfer over to the other movements. Much like we see RDLs transfer to conventional deadlifts, we will also see strength in conventional deadlifts transfer to RDLs. And so unless you are that type of personality where you can literally just hammer the same movement 12 months a year and not even worry about it at all, I think there's definitely value in the strength movement, regardless of whether you're doing the rep ranges for strength or for hypertrophy.
So with this cycle, you're going to have swaps for hypertrophy movements. For example, let's say there's a part 2 that's another strength movement. Do you need to stay with a strength type movement, or can you do like the low bar back squat and then do maybe like the RDL for the next movement? I don't know. Is that, or like even just during different days of the week? Like, is can you mix and match, or you gotta stay consistent?
You can 100% mix and match. Yeah, that's one of the big
Ooh.
things I actually that's one of the big things I harped on in the blog, is that you can certainly mix and match, but as I'm sure you guys know, and our audience probably knows too, as they're quite educated, is that we would want to stick with our selection for the entire 7 weeks. So if we're picking low bar back squat for strength work, we can't get to week 4 and be like, I don't feel like low bar back squatting today. I'm going to go hack squat and do the hypertrophy rep ranges, right? You just want to stick with low bar back squat for 7 weeks, see it through from beginning to end. And same thing if you were to choose a hypertrophy movement.
So this is just for this cycle, this kind of like dual option thing. Is there any drawback or any reason why you couldn't continue that kind of approach, right? Like where you say, like maybe you really just want to get your squat up like throughout, maybe it's like a huge goal of yours, right? Is there any particular reason why you couldn't continue that kind of training for a longer period of time?
Yeah, I mean, you could, but I mean, I think the reason that our programs are designed and periodized the way that they are over each 26-week period is because we are a physique optimization company. We want to look our damn best and have the best balance of like life and training. So in that case, like I feel like if we're constantly doing low rep strength work with a low bar back squat, we are over the course of time going to probably see some small amount less growth in certain target muscle groups that we may get more of with a more quad bias movement. And so, no, it's not the end of the world, but I don't think it fits into like the design and structure of the way that we present our programs over the course of a periodized year.
Years and years ago, we actually used to have 12 to 15 week cycles. And then over time, we did move to shorter cycles. And so typically, again, with hypertrophy, we're usually in 12-week cycles. But in this case, we actually split it where half of it is strength and then half of that is the metabolic hypertrophy. Can you kind of explain why we made that shift to not having strength cycles that were 12 weeks long or 15 weeks long?
The first part of the answer goes back to what I just said about just like optimization of physique being best when training with specific movements in specifically targeted hypertrophy rep ranges. I think the main reason we shortened that was because of just incredible levels of accumulated fatigue that people were experiencing. And so it's interesting actually, because with all the new research that's been coming out and this new preprint, which I think in many ways just reiterates what we already knew about strength, but this whole idea of, you really can be further from failure. And in fact, it's not just you can be further from failure, but you should be further from failure for strength work. Like, for example, I'll reference one of the studies that I always talk about, which is Karsten and colleagues from 2021. They compared 4 sets of 10 to failure. So that's your typical hypertrophy work, 4 sets of 10 to failure. And then they took the exact same weight that they were doing for 4 sets of 10, and they just had people do it for 8 sets of 5. So you're still getting 40 reps. You're still using the same weight for those 40 reps. It's just that one of those is to failure and the other one has essentially 5 reps in reserve on every set. And the group that did 4 sets of 10 saw better hypertrophy, and the group that did 8 sets of 5 saw better strength increases. I think that when you look at this body of research and you see how much strength is benefited further from failure, and then if you actually were to create a program that literally kept people 5 reps from failure the entire time, I think we could realistically put together a 12 to 15 week strength program that wouldn't kill people. But the way that we've kind of built the programming in these 6 or 7 week accumulation blocks is that you build up, you get closer and closer to failure, and then you kind of test at the end. And so that fits in the model of the way that Paragon runs our programs. Doing this super far from failure thing over the course of like a 12 or 15 week cycle, it would change the way in which we have to do things. Add that on top of the fact that that probably isn't the most optimal way to build muscle based on that Karsten and colleagues study. It seems like we would be spending a ton of time doing something that doesn't directly contribute to increasing muscle mass aesthetics or physique goals.
With the 7-week cycle, how should someone progress week to week in terms of, hey, like I'm starting here. Maybe I have this goal at the end of this cycle to PR by X amount of pounds. How should they progress? Like, is there a rule of thumb, like percentage wise, or rather like, what's that gonna look like? Cause like from week 1 to week 2 to week 3.
Yeah, it's a lot of feel. I mean, as we've discussed on prior podcasts, for all the reasons we don't use percentages.
Yeah. Like I did 200 the previous week. How much should I go up the next week? Right.
Essentially, the way it's very linear, the way that it's approaching. And so if you look at this, we'll eliminate the taper week just for the sake of ease of understanding. So if from week 1 through week 6, it would go reps 6 in week 1, then 5 reps in week 2, 4 reps in week 3, and then 3, then 2, then 1, right? So every week we're decreasing 1 rep. The other factor is to consider is that we're also trying to work closer to failure each week too. And so it's not just, hey, I'm going from 6 reps in week 1 to 5 reps in week 2, and it's the same proximity to failure. You're also trying to get a little closer to failure. So therefore, the percentage that you can jump is probably actually more than what you would think just going from 6 reps to 5 reps. You're actually going from 6 reps to 5 reps, but with the ability to do even an extra rep. Because you're going from 6 reps at 4 reps from failure. So you could do 10 reps. And then you're going to 5 reps at 3 reps from failure. So you actually could only do 8 reps. So you're really actually increasing load 2 reps, even though it's 1 rep. Did that make any sense?
I mean, probably it just have to be by feel. But like if I was doing 200 pounds for 6 reps, would I be incorrect by saying, okay, well, like the next week, I'm just going to jump up like 5% and see what that's like. And then if I can go up a little bit more, would I just try to go up a little bit more the next time? Like, because if it felt really easy, could I just go up the next week a little bit more, make a bigger jump?
Of course, yeah. And like fatigue is cumulative. And so, yeah, you really don't want to over fatigue in the beginning of the cycle. You'd rather undershoot in the beginning and leave yourself more runway. Like, wouldn't it be great if you got to the final week and you were like, man, I think I'm only going to hit like 240 because last week I hit 230. And then you're like, oh, 280. That was cool. Like
that actually happened to me on a couple of years ago when we did the strength cycles and stuff like that. And I hit that deadlift. It was a 460. I had a 460 deadlift, but I never really got close to that amount. I mean, I think we ended up doing like a set of 3 and maybe I got like a deadlift for like 420 or something like that. I never really got close to that. And I was thinking, oh, I'm only going to get like maybe like 440 on the deadlift. I ended up in like 460. And I said, cause like I never really went to like true failure. I always left some in the tank. And you were mentioning these studies, about fatigue management.
And that's how I think that most strength should be approached. And if you even look at the science on the way that like sprinters train or the way that like Olympic lifters train and stuff like that, like if they do hit their pie in the sky goal, that's going to be months before the actual competition. It's not like you're working up to a weight and then you're hitting that weight the week before your competition and then you're going and doing it again a week later. Like you're hitting, like if you want to snatch 250, you're going to hit 215 for a couple singles and just like feel really good about that. And then on game day, you go 215, 235, 255 or something like that. And boom, you set a PR, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of things where the stars have to align. But as far as creating like a practical approach for people outside of your example where you far exceeded your own expectations, there could be some value in looking at where you want to end up and then working backwards from there. If you look at like, hey, my 1 rep max, like it would be really cool if I had a 300 pound 1 rep max on testing day. And I know, so I know I want to start week 1 with 6 reps at say 200 pounds. Mm-hmm. And so then you have 100 pounds that you need to make up between 6 reps and 1 rep. And you have 6 weeks to do that minus the taper week. Then yes, you would essentially need to approach that in looking at adding about 16 pounds per week to the bar, which I think would actually correlate pretty well with what you would expect in dropping a rep and working a rep closer to failure.
And knowing that you don't need to actually hit that 300 prior to, like, I mean, you can get close-ish, but you don't need to actually hit it. And that taper week actually helps a lot too, with just like flushing out that fatigue. Like you feel like shit going into the taper week and you come out of the taper week, you're like, we ready.
Yeah. I'm a superstar now.
Yeah.
Well, Bryan, do you remember there's like, I think it was the summer strength cycle. I feel like it was the summer strength cycle when I hit my like 300 plus pound deadlift. And we had so many people that it was like they were posting their PRs on stuff like deadlifts and hip thrusts. And it was like maybe they never lifted more than like 200, 210, 220. And then it would be like, yo, I hit 300, 315, 325. So that's like what I always think back to. And I just love younger me because I was 100% the person I'd be like, oh, well, I just need to go like heavy, heavy, heavy. And now I'm like, light. We keeping it lighter. We farther from failure. And then,
Yeah, just because you keep it lighter doesn't mean that you can't perform on game day. Like just because you don't hit 300 doesn't mean you can't hit 300. So yeah, I think that that's really the biggest thing that's come out of this strength research is just understanding that repetition with perfect execution is the thing that's going to transfer to game day. It's not tons and tons of reps where you're reminding yourself that you can do it, because it's those reps where like you get really beat up and you're like, look, I can do this. And then game day comes and you're like, oh, I'm so fatigued. I can't do this, So yeah, I think underperforming, so to speak, in the beginning of the cycle can lead to much bigger increases toward the end.
Bryan, can you kind of get into like if someone's ultimate goal was weight loss / fat loss, are there still benefits that they could find from doing a strength cycle?
I do, for sure. I think the nice thing about a strength cycle is that you need significantly less carbs. Like if you're going to diet, eliminating carbs is not my favorite way to diet, but it is a very popular way to diet. Yeah, strength work, when you're doing sets of basically 1 to 5, the amount of actual carbohydrate storage that you need is significantly low. Most of your work is just going to be powered by ATP. And so you definitely are going to need more glycogen and carbohydrate stores for the hypertrophy rep ranges, or even beyond that for metabolic, of course. But yeah, so strength can be conducive to weight loss. I don't love the idea of working up to 1 rep maxes when you're dieting. And that's just because your body's already in like a semi-fragile state. Like your recovery is not optimized. Whether you're able to physically perform the load or not, it's likely you probably won't. And then there's the psychological side of feeling like you're underachieving or that you're losing muscle in some way. And we know that 1 rep max strength is not correlative to whether you're losing muscle on a diet or not. And you're just more likely to want to see your strength numbers remain similar in the 6 to 12 or 6 to 10 rep range than you necessarily would trying to work up to a 1 rep max. I do think that there's probably value, and this is actually something that the N1 guys do a lot, is they'll put people into what they call a neurological phase when they diet specifically. So they will purposefully coordinate the diet with the strength phase, but they're primarily working in the like 4 to 8 rep range. They're never going to like 3, 2, 1 max out type thing. And so they're just hanging out in the 4 to 8 rep range. They're using that as an opportunity to take in less carbohydrate, knowing that it's mostly ATP based and neurological. And so they've had great success with that. And so it's something that I think is certainly an option. And the way that I programmed this strength cycle, the hypertrophy rep ranges are kind of lower. Like they're generally, 5 to 8, 6 to 10 in most cases. And so we are kind of treading that boundary between strength work and hypertrophy work. And it's certainly not getting into like what would be considered metabolic, because we have the metabolic cycle coming up after the strength phase. And so I want to make sure that even for those people that are doing hypertrophy, that they're not flirting with those like 12, 15, 20 rep sets right now. So I think it is like this cycle is great to follow the hypertrophy rep ranges, since they are slightly skewed to the strength zones while you're dieting. I just don't really think that you're going to get a ton out of the strength phase if you're following the 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 max out type approach.
Let's say somebody ultimately is like, hey, I totally hear you that, soon you want to be working on weight loss, you want to diet, you want to cut your calories and all those things. But, hey, we have this 7-week cycle coming up. Here's why you should follow it. And I think you'd find a lot of value in it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this so much, especially with women. There's just something super empowering about lifting heavy. And so I think that's really the number one reason. Like if you were to just try to pin me down and be like, yeah, there's something really cool that you feel really strong and badass when you lift heavy weights. And then I would probably back that out and say, and on top of that, you get the benefit of having a better gauge of proximity to failure when you're lifting in lower rep ranges. And so this is actually one of the things that was elucidated in that preprint that I keep referencing, the meta-regression from Robinson and colleagues, is they actually showed that hypertrophy increases as you get closer to and even beyond failure. But that's specific to being in higher rep ranges. It seems that when you looked at their meta regression and you looked at the sets of hypertrophy work that were in the like 5 to 8 rep range, that you actually didn't really need to be that close to failure because the reps are stimulative from the get-go. And there's just less ambiguity about whether you are close to failure. Like when you're doing a set of 20 rep leg extensions, most people are going to stop that 20 rep set of leg extensions when the shit starts burning, not when they're physically incapable of actually extending their knee anymore. And so that then leads to most people actually being like, hey, I was at failure, when you're actually 5 reps from failure or something like that. However, when you're in the 5 to 8 rep range, it's like, hey, as soon as you do that first rep, you're already 5 reps from failure. And so it just gives you a much better gauge of how close you are to failure, but also provides you stimulus, like in those lower rep ranges. We talked about how you don't need to even be close to failure for strength work. So by lifting these heavy weights and empowering yourself, you're able to get a ton of muscular and strength benefit without even having to necessarily work to that point of failure, which can be sometimes scary for people.
I would also add too, man, like if you're cross training, like coming from an endurance background, especially, being stronger helps you get better at these endurance events and sports. A stronger body is going to be so much more resilient to injury and be able to perform better. So like, yeah, I mean, take some time to lift some heavy weights and get stronger, and then you can go back to your normally scheduled, training.
You don't have to lift singles, doubles, and triples though to get strong. Like you can get strong in hypertrophy rep ranges. Yeah.
But I mean, again, it's like that's part of the value of just, lifting a little bit, like doing something like a strength cycle. It's just building some more resilience, body resilience. For sure.
Yeah. And I mean, there's certainly neurological advantages. Like we talk a lot in the blog. I write about this study by Schoenfeld from either last year or the year before, where they had 2 groups, and one group just did a hypertrophy phase and the other group did a strength phase and then a hypertrophy phase. And the group that did the strength phase and then the hypertrophy phase actually saw better hypertrophy. So I think that, there's certainly holes in that study, as there are in many. No study is perfect. But I think that can instill some confidence, at least in that style of periodization.
Are there any misconceptions or mistakes you see people making with strength cycles?
Yeah, I think you're right in that we'll probably be recapping a little, but I think probably the biggest one is working close to failure and grinding reps. And this is one that I think is it makes sense. It's intuitive as to why. Like, there's a lot of importance placed on 1 rep max testing. And so you get into this idea that there's something beneficial about those slow grinding reps where you're not sure if you're going to make it. And it's taken many years for me to relinquish that mindset. I even remember the strength phase that I designed after the CrossFit days, maybe like 2019 or something. And I buried myself. Like I was like, all right, cool. I can back squat this much. So I'm going to start my cycle at 365 triples. And it was fine. Right. And then it was like next week, 385, then 405, then, oh shit, So it's like what I should have done was just hung out at 315 for a while and just like done really fast triples and like gotten really good at triples there. And then, gone to doubles at 365 or whatever it is. Like I misprogrammed the cycle because I was so heavily influenced by the poor way in which programming was done back in those days. And so now with all the new research we have, it's just a different world. The evidence-based space has exploded. And so the idea of training further from failure for strength is 100% like the main thing that people need to change. Just get comfortable being 5+ reps from failure and just hammering technique.
It's like, if you're moving like garbage, well, congrats. Like we've missed the point for sure.
Yeah. I mean, if the way that you're practicing doesn't resemble the way that you're playing, right? Like practice weeks, testing weeks, however you want to look at that analogy. Practice the way you want to play.
Brian, do you remember the Dave Castro video when he was deadlifting? It takes him like a minute to deadlift.
It was like 460 or something.
Yeah, like have you seen that? Laura, do you know what I'm talking about?
Is he like twerking once he gets
to the top?
top?
It took literally like 10 seconds for him.
That's what I was thinking. When you were talking about that, that's what I was thinking, like about the grinding reps thing. And I'll be honest, like I coming again from that space and then the weightlifting, heavy lifting space, like I felt like if you weren't grinding reps, like you weren't doing nothing, but that couldn't be any more further from the truth of actually what's beneficial.
Even the 1 rep max attempts of elite lifters, it almost looks effortless. Like because you've been there, that like they're struggling internally. But when you watch someone sumo deadlift, it's weird. It's like the moment it breaks the floor, it's just like pop, the hips come through and you're like, whoa, that's your 1 rep max? What?
Yeah, there's going to be some, maybe like if you're really truly getting like close to that, like 1 rep max, like a true 1 rep max, like it's probably not going to be like the bar's not going to be moving super fast. But like we're talking about training, like during training, it should not be like that bar speed shouldn't be slowing down so much that it's like, that's 56K modem knife or like whatever the old school modem speed dial up modem, man. Like we really should not be that way. Yeah.
I feel like you almost don't even want to see any rep slow down when you're practicing in training. Because if you're talking about being 5 reps from failure, it's usually around that like 3 to 4 rep from failure point where you start to see rep slow. So if you're doing triples at 80%, which is a very standard like powerlifting type thing to do, you should be hitting that 3rd rep at approximately 5 RIR. And so yeah, all those reps should just be clean and snappy, and you really shouldn't see much issue with that.
And even too, like with like the resetting, if you're like sitting there at the top, like taking 10 breaths, right?
Yeah.
Probably shouldn't see that either with if we're going at a load that is conducive.
Yeah, I mean, you just hit the top, you take a breath, and confidently that you can just go down and replicate that performance again.
We totally saw one in the Instagram group the other day, and it like brought me back because I was like, oh, I for sure used to squat like this. But the video was someone squatting and she gets to the bottom and she like stopped, paused, and then like bounced to get out of it. And so we were laughing and we were commenting back and forth. I was like, oh, I used to do this back in my weightlifting days. And it was like, I jokingly would always call it like the Beyonce bounce, because the joke in the gym was like, if I could get under it, right? Like I could clean something, be at a dead stop, but my front squat was so freaking high that I knew if I just popped up. And the thing is, what are we training for? Because being able to use that stretch reflex is great if you are Olympic weightlifting and trying to win the things. But again, if we're talking about like, I'm actually just really trying to get strong, or I'm trying to improve my physique or whatever it is, it's like, well, then we probably don't want to be doing that. We do just want more like the raw, pure strength of, can you hit the bottom? And then can we just get back up?
Yeah. And I feel like the grinding, like those types of things we've done, that's always where I've got hurt.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's almost impossible to grind a back squat or really any movement, but you can see it really well on a back squat without compensation occurring. Like if you ever see anyone hit that midpoint where they just kind of stop and then wobble a little bit and then they keep going, the reason they're able to keep going is because their body figured out neurological connection to have some other part of their body take over. Because just getting to that point where you stop and wobble means the area you're trying to work failed. And so you'll either see like the torso forward a little bit, the hips kick up a little bit, any number of compensations that occur. But that is literally like when you grind something, the nature of grinding is such that there is compensation occurring.
And so I think the best advice there, right, is it's just like, especially if this is a movement you haven't done in a while, or you're a little bit rusty, or maybe you're all new together, it's like, please watch the videos in the app, check out our points of performance that we always list in the app. Because same thing, it's like every time we do sumo deadlifts, my favorite is like, people have their hands really wide or their feet, it's like everybody's just all over the place. So just make sure, exactly like Bryan said, it's like, if we're either having the weird compensations, we've got the booty, popping up when we're trying to squat, or we're just not in the right positions. Like,
Yeah.
double check yourself.
Beyonce bounce. I love
Yeah,
that.
it's so good. It's so good. I do want to add in just one caveat for all the people listening, because I think that after this conversation, we're going to have a lot of members realizing that within the structure of the way I programmed this, that we are working closer to failure each week, and thus there will be weeks where you are going to have rep speed slow as you drive up through these movements. And so that's mostly a product of this being a 7-week cycle. When I'm talking about all this research on staying 5 reps from failure all the time and just like hammering perfect technique, this is like mostly done on people that strength training is their life. They do this 52 weeks a year. We're trying to cram a 7-week strength cycle in the most efficient manner, right, into this like 7-week period. And so we have to use intensity, or in this case, being closer to failure, as one of our tools to get the most out of our 7 weeks. So it's a slightly different approach than you would see if we were creating like a 52-week periodized cycle, where we would have very large periods of time where we're just training 5 reps from failure all the time. In this case, we just have to be a little bit more direct and quick with our progressions, because we have the 7-week period to fit it in.
What would you say to someone that kind of has the sentiments of like, hey, listen, like, I don't really care if I hit PRs, or I don't really care. It's like I lift because I know it's good for me, especially as I'm getting older and stuff like that. But like, what sentiments would you give that person? It's just like, like in that debacle of like, I'm not really motivated by PRs and stuff like that. So like, why should I still follow a strength cycle, or why should I do this?
The best benefit to the lower rep ranges is going to be neurological conditioning, essentially just figuring out how to coordinate all the different neurological firings in your body to achieve a task. And the same thing needs to be done as we age, to like get a suitcase into the overhead compartment of an airplane, or lift a couch to move it if that's something that we have to do at some point. And so strength training heavy does set you up to succeed at that. But you like I said, you don't have to be super close to failure. And so first off, you don't have to do the strength cycle. You can do the hypertrophy cycle if that's more your thing, like train in the hypertrophy cycle. But it seems like with this person, the issue seems to be more that they just don't want to like work super hard and like work really close to failure anyways. They just kind of want to like go into the gym and go through the motions, right? For the most part. And so in that case, I think like you can use a little bit of like daily RPE for yourself. Like, hey, I feel great today. I know lifting isn't my number one priority, but I need a program that has some structure to it so that I can follow something. You're going to get a ton of benefit if you just ignore all of my reps from failure recommendations and you just go in and you lift some weights. Like you go in and you pick up some dumbbells and you do some bench presses because the program says to do them. And you stop when it gets kind of hard, but you don't really care if you're 2 reps from failure or 6 reps from failure. That's fine. Like you're going to get some benefit from that. So I don't have a lot to say to this person other than it's great that you're showing up and continuing to do the thing. And the way that this person feels about weight training is very much the way that I felt about cardio until a year ago. And now you look at me and I fucking love cardio, man. Like in some ways, I actually look forward to my zone 2 rides more than I do to lifting now, because it's just it's just a completely different mindset and necessary level of mental focus. And so maybe this person will find eventually that if they just keep showing up at the gym and they continue to get better at the movements, they refine technique, and they learn that they can push themselves, they might actually find that they love being in the gym and they love pushing themselves and they love seeing themselves get stronger. And that's awesome. Like I think part of the reason I love cardio is because I am getting so much better at it so quickly. And that's the beauty of any novel pursuit. Like as we get older, we don't do a lot of new things where adaptation curve is staggeringly fast. Like how often are we like as a 30-some, 40-year-old, whatever, being like, I'm going to pick up art class because I'm not very good at art. Well, that would be great if you did, because you'd probably get better really quickly and it would be really cool for you. It'd be like a confirmation bias for like all of your self-worth. And it feels that way when I'm doing cardio sometimes. It's like, I am awesome because I'm improving. And, I go to lift weights and I feel like I'm beating my head against a wall constantly. Like, oh, one more rep. Like I had to work so hard for that rep. But this new person coming in, they might not love weight training, but they might learn to love it. And it might be because it gives them this ability to like achieve, which maybe they're not doing in other parts of their life.
As we get older, the more and more benefit we would find from strength training. And that's why I always love, like, I think CrossFit is so good about sharing videos where it'll be like, hey, here is this badass person that is 60 years old, 70 years old, 80 years old, just, ripping weight. My parents, I'm like, I love y'all, but I wish y'all were more active and I wish y'all were doing more because it would help you age better and probably also help you be around longer, right?
Yeah, I mean, weight training, as far as like longevity goes, you can't argue with it. I mean, everybody should be weight training for longevity. Bone density is just the beginning of it. But, you talk about the fact that people over 65, 50% of people over 65 that fall and break a hip are dead within 1 year. And that sounds like super morbid to say. That's a stat that I heard and I couldn't believe it. It was staggering. And so you have to avoid falls. Like that has to be the number one concern as you get older. And almost all falls occur eccentrically. So it's not going up the stairs or climbing up the curb. It's trying to step down the stairs or step down the curb or step out of your car. And weight training, what does weight training have? It has a ton of eccentric loading. We need that shit. That is really, really good for us. And it also helps with balance and stability. When it comes to longevity, I mean, 300% decrease in mortality when you have muscle in the top 25 percentile compared to those in the bottom 25 percentile. And the only thing that is more significant than that is VO2 max, which is 500% comparison. So, you got to have muscle and you got to have strength.
Yeah, there's just so much more to lifting than just hitting PRs, man. If all I cared about PRs, I would have been stopped lifting them years ago because I don't think I've hit any all-time personal best in years. So, I mean, the last one I did was that deadlift. So, I mean, there's just so much more about lifting. And like you said, like from the longevity, you cannot argue that it is crucial.
There's something about just like I wake up every day excited for some reason. And I know that's a blessing. Like there's a lot of people that wake up with anxiety or depression or any other number of reasons that keep them from wanting to get out of bed in the morning. But weightlifting truly is one of the main reasons that I am excited to wake up every day because there's a session that I can look at and I have to attack and it's on the menu and it gives me a purpose. And I think there's just so much value in that.
We talked about this, I think, on the last episode, or we had with you. But like, if you're a beginner to the cycles, would you recommend starting with the hypertrophy, or like just doing the hypertrophy, or what would you recommend if someone was just brand new?
If you're like a brand new rank beginner, like you've never lifted weights before, then the prudent move is probably to start with hypertrophy. However, if you have some training background at all, I don't really see a reason you can't do strength work. Like feel free to, submit your form check videos into either the app or into Facebook group. And we have our coaches and myself that are going to come in and comment and help you out and get you straightened out. So I would just say the only caution, if you did want to jump into a strength cycle and you weren't like super well versed on, what your 1 rep maxes are or, very confident in lifting heavy weights, would just be prudent and just don't lift heavy weights. Like start light. And we just talked about that earlier in the episode, how those that start lighter in the beginning are probably going to actually end up with better results in the end anyways. So I would just, encourage that person to, train lighter, focus on technique, and week to week build as they are comfortable.
Because I can see like a person who's like new and, they would probably say something like, well, I don't know what my PRs and my 1 rep maxes are. Should I even try to do a strength cycle, right? Like, I mean.
Yeah, establish them. Let's find out what they are. It's the same thing as like Laura had never done a DEXA before. And she did a DEXA because 6 months from now, she wants to do another DEXA and compare. Same idea. Like, who cares what your numbers are? Let's find out, because guess what? 6 months from now, we have another strength cycle and we're going to find out how much improvement you've made.
What advice would you give for anyone that's like, yo, I want to be about squatting, but I hate squatting because it hurts my knees.
Yeah, I mean, we have all been there, right? I know me and you both have had knee issues. Alex, have you had knee issues from squatting?
Temporarily. Yeah. I mean, just, the tendonitis sometimes. Yeah. But nothing long term.
You know what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years since I stopped squatting like a CrossFitter? My knees stopped hurting.
You're not a fan of like the back squat. I remember you saying that. You're like, man, I'm like, I don't know, Bryan.
It's not my favorite move, for sure. I just think there's much better ways. I actually really like the low bar back squat. I think the low bar back squat feels really good for me. The high bar back squat just doesn't work with my anatomy super well. But yeah, so I'm not a huge fan of back squat, but it's squatting in general causing knee pain. Like that's, I think, more the issue than it being a back squat specifically. It's like, hey, just the action of sitting down into like a knee flexed position and standing back up seems to hurt my knees. And that was what I was experiencing. I mean, a lot of that was just from squatting improperly. And so the two areas I think that are going to be super important here are one is controlling your descent. So you're not just dropping to the bottom like a rock, right? Because this leads to point number 2, which is if you drop like a rock, then you have to catch yourself at the bottom. And our
that's when your knees are like crunch, crunch, crunch.
Our knees don't love that. They don't love that shearing force on them at the bottom there. So if you control the descent super slowly down, and then you pause at the bottom, and then you don't bounce out, because what is bouncing out doing? You're doing a mini catch, and then you're using that force to propel you back up.
Your knees snap, crackle, pop.
Yeah. I mean, just like Lori said earlier, that Beyonce bounce is great for Olympic weightlifting. Like that's literally why you train it, because you have to be able to do that in competition.
I mean, really though, even with that, I would say like it's still controlled. Like it's not like a straight up like, oh, I'm just gonna fall to the bottom like type stuff. Like you still gotta control that, even with like maybe a snatch and clean and jerk.
I mean, I feel like most of the time those guys are catching it an inch or two above their rock bottom. And then they are kind of dropping. But they're not dropping from the top. They're dropping from 2 inches. And then they're using that stretch reflex effect.
You can't create a stretch reflex if you're totally loose in the bottom. Like you still have to have some tightness. And that's the thing. Like people, I think, misconceptions like, oh, I'm just going to freaking fall down in between my legs and then I'm going to stand up with this heavy ass weight. No, it's not.
Yeah, you're going to get stuck and not move and have no stretch reflex if you kind of lose your midline in your core and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, though, as soon as I stopped dropping and bouncing out of the bottom of squat movements, knee pain just went away. Like I literally don't have any knee pain anymore at all. So it's, I would say that that's the main thing. And like, there are going to be people that even with that change in squat form, they're still going to have knee pain. And that's just really unfortunate. It's part of genetics. And some people just have, smaller joint structure and their knees maybe have been beat up from the past and maybe they're just not going to get better at this point. If you're a runner, maybe try to stop running because there's a lot of shearing force on your knees when you run as well. Maybe pick up biking. If you're controlling your descent and you're not bouncing out of the bottom, those are the 2 main things I think that you can do.
You can also do other exercises, yeah? Like maybe like leg press.
Of course.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's a squat. Like when you talk about knee flexion, like a leg press is a squat, as a hack squat is a squat, or a pendulum or a back squat. Like I have a feeling if you have knee pain in a back squat, you probably have knee pain in a leg press too.
Something I was going to add on, and again, this was just like, man, where was this the first, 7, 8, 10 years of lifting? But I was always high bar squatting because I came from the CrossFit background. So nobody in CrossFit gyms was ever low bar squatting. And with my anatomy, as we know, it's like we're polar opposites, Bryan. So it's like, I got the really long legs. So for me, high bar is so much knee over toe. So when I switched to low bar, my knees don't hurt because again, it's like we're changing the torso position. We're actually changing the whole movement pattern and range of motion. So that was going to be the other one I was going to throw in the pot is like low bar is such a delicate animal because you have to be set up properly. And a lot of people try low bar, but they don't have their hands in the right position. They've got their wrists really bent and cranked back, or they're not doing a true low bar squat. And so that's why they hate it. I think if you can really lean in and give low bar a try, there's so many good YouTube resources. If you type in low bar back squats, and I'm dying right now because there's a specific power lifter that like we're always linking his videos because we're like, yo, nobody says it better than this guy. But truly, you know, leaning into low bar could be life changing. It does just have a really big learning curve. My other question for you, Bryan, is kind of similarly, we see similar sentiments from people where it'll be like, hey, listen, I want to love deadlifting, but deadlifting always hurts my back. I always wake up with lower back pain. Like, what, again, what do I do?
Yeah, I mean, this one is the same idea kind of in reverse, but the likelihood is that their lower back is flexing throughout the movement. And you can't know that without seeing it. You know, slight lower back flexion is okay if it's maintained throughout. You'll see this with a lot of really solid lifters where they'll start in like very slight flexion, but then it won't actually change throughout the lift. They'll just maintain that slight flexion throughout the entire thing. Where we see a lot of low back pain is where we see low back position change from either a neutral or an extended position into a flexed position. So you can think of those people that start in their setup and they have really good form and you're like, yeah, that setup looks great. And then as soon as they begin pulling, it's like, like question mark, you know. So that's a big problem. And so I think, not to say that no one has low back pain with RDLs, because there certainly are people that do, but I think that taking someone that struggles with deadlifts and says they have low back pain, giving them a few weeks off where you're just going to let the low back heal. So you're not going to move directly from deadlifts into RDLs, but you take a few week reprieve. You don't do any hip hinging. Maybe you do some hip thrusts or something like that, but you don't do any like bending at the hips. And then once their back is feeling better, you transition them to RDLs and you condition them to think about moving the hips back and the hips forward instead of bending the torso down and lifting the torso up. And when you start thinking of the RDL as this horizontal movement of the hips instead of the vertical movement of the torso, then now we start ingraining the proper hip hinge pattern. And so what's going to happen is when this person goes back to deadlifting, say 6 months, 12 months later, after they've made the RDL the habit, you have to make it into a habit. Your deadlift is going to be completely different than it was because you're not going to be able to disentangle the way that that felt from the RDL to the deadlift. You're going to, or rather, I should say, you will be able to feel when you deadlift and things go awry. You will be able to feel that moment where that's happening, and you'll know to either back the weight off or change your setup and execution.
And I'm a plug sumo deadlifts. I wish I found them sooner. Like, again, it's like, because I think like, it's like if I were to peg like 3 places people go wrong in deadlift, one is a lot of times they're like loosey-goosey up top. And so there's no engagement, or like we aren't tight in the shoulders and the back area. So we're already starting, you know, kind of slouchy. The second one I would go to is most people don't know where to start their hips in terms of, okay, when you know, right before you go to rip and pick up the bar, well, how high is your butt in the air? Because again, for years and years, people would be like, okay, like your butt's too high, you know, you should be snapping down and your chest needs to go up. And it's like, well, every time I would deadlift, my hips would shoot up and then the rest of my body would follow. And it's because, again, you know, it's like now, fast forward, I know I got really long legs, and therefore that's where my body is most advantageous to pull and rip. And so understanding there is not a one size fits all, but like your body going to tell you, like if you're videoing yourself and every single time your hips immediately shoot up to here, well, start there because that's probably where you generate the most power.
And some people it could be the complete opposite though. Like I've seen people like they cannot sumo, but then they can do conventional. So I think with something like deadlift, like you just got to find what works for your anatomy.
Yeah, I can't sumo at all. It really it feels extremely awkward. It feels like it's stretching my groin out the entire time.
I was gonna say you got those tight hips.
Yeah.
Those hips don't lie.
Bryan, one question I did have about when we're talking about these deadlifts and stuff. I know like during, you know, hypertrophy cycles and stuff like that, we do things like RDLs and stuff like that, and people use like grips. What is your opinion on using things like grips or belts or anything like that to like kind of, especially grips, like to facilitate? Because I know you had said you want to use grips for things like hypertrophy because you don't want your grip to be the limiting factor. But now we're going for like a max, like a higher effort load. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? What are your opinion?
Man, yeah, I'm indifferent, honestly. Like, I tend to still use grips when I get above like 400 pounds for a deadlift, which is about 80-ish% of my max deadlift from back in the day. Yeah, it really depends how weak your grip is, and then B, how important it is for you to have a strong grip. And that second part is an interesting question because grip is another thing that's related to longevity. Like, of all the strength mechanisms that we have, it seems like grip strength is the most predictive of mortality.
I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense though, because it is sort of representative of your body strength overall, right? And so Peter Attia has actually put out 2 tests that he wants all of his clients to be able to do. And it involves a 2-minute dead hang from a pull-up bar. So you literally just hang there and you should be able to make 2 minutes. That's the passing score or whatever, elite level for grip strength. And then he wants you to be able to take half of your body weight in each hand. So that would be, for me, if I weigh 200 pounds, that would be 100 pounds in each hand, and walk with it for between 1 and 2 minutes without setting it down.
Pretty hard.
Yeah. My sense is that if you can do those 2 grip challenges, then it shouldn't matter if you're using grip on your deadlifts, but you may also not need grip on your deadlifts if you can do those challenges. So it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing. But the one caveat I will add to that is that we tend to promote overhand deadlifting here just for the sake. I mean, the small possibility that you could tear a bicep with the mixed grip is certainly a possibility. Like, you do see this happen. Or that you could develop some kind of weird imbalances and stuff, because most people do tend to just do one side. Like, they have a strong side and they're like, hey, I always go right hand forward, or I always go left hand forward. So for those reasons, I do still tend to lean on using straps for heavy deadlift work so that I can do it overhand.
Mm-hmm.
I think ultimately it's an individual decision, and I don't really feel like super strongly about it either way for strength cycles.
Speaking from personal experience for me, like when I did pull that 460, I almost tore my bicep. So and I was mixed gripping. So like I was like, now I'm gonna double overhand grip. I don't use straps, but I use the hook grip. But trying to pull, I'd probably pull like a heavy deadlift. I'm gonna have to train my grips for that. But yeah, I would definitely recommend like double overhand grip. If your goal is just like, hey, like I want to just train and for longevity or, whatever. I'm not trying to go to world powerlifting championships.
Yeah. Do you guys both use the same hand forward as well, or do you mix it up?
Yeah, mine's always, my left hand is always the one that's palm up.
Yeah, I figured most people don't change it up. They have one way that they feel strong and they just stick with that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think it's like y'all nailed it, because it really just depends who we're talking to. Because for it's like if we're newer to lifting, you need to go spend the time, man. Like, I want to say, like, earn the ability to use straps. But again, it's like if we can't do very basic sets or, pretty lightweight, well, yeah, using straps or using grips is going to be a crutch. But then reversely, it's like, I feel like it was a Mind Pump Media clip or something on Instagram, and it was based like straps are cheating, blah blah blah, and it's like, bro, we can't just also throw out blanket statements, because it's like, I am not trying to tear up my hands. I don't want them to look like a cheese grater. I don't want nasty callous hands to be all touching my boyfriend. Yeah. And so it's like overheat.
Neither does Charlie, trust me.
But it's like, what are we training for? Because again, it's like, if you are somebody that's maybe a CrossFit personality, you love dropping into CrossFit classes on occasion, Well, yeah, it's probably really helpful for you to train your grip more. Even, same with Alex. It's like, well, you need good grip strength for jujitsu and being able to choke people out. But reversely, like I said, it's like, yo, I go to the gym to lift, to have fun and, do the thing. But I'm sitting at my computer all day. So like, what does it matter if I can hang on to the barbell or, whatever when it gets heavier? But same thing, it's like, even as I've been rehabbing back from surgery, that's been the thing that was so wild is it's like, because I had so much nerve damage and all this stuff that I was trying to heal from, it's like, I'd be like rep 6, 7, 8. And I mean, the bar would be like 65 pounds, right? And so it was like, I've tried really hard the past few months of like, I'm not using grips, I'm not using straps. Like I need to actually build back the strength. But like I said, it's like, yo, if I'm lifting heavy, best believe I'm using straps and grips and all the BS, once we get into the cycle later.
Bryan, do you own one of those grip strength tester things?
Captain of Crush Gripper.
Yeah.
No, I don't, but I'm probably going to buy one just because I'm dying to know what I can do. I've heard that they're like really, really hard and that I likely can't even do like the number 2 or the number 3. And I think there's 5 of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I am intrigued and I will likely buy them at some point.
So Alex, you gonna go hypertrophy or you gonna go strength? I know we've kind of both taken a backseat on the strength cycles, and for me, it was just like whatever was going on with life. I think actually what happened was when I had my deviated septum surgery, it was the same time as when we were doing like strength cycle stuff, and so that's why I'm so excited to be like, oh my god, give me a deadlift, give me some squats, give me all the goods. But yeah, I feel like you didn't do the last strength cycle.
I feel like I have intentions always to do the strength cycle, and then something happens, and I'm just like, you know what, we're just gonna go back. But honestly, the ability to kind of mix and match is a bit intriguing to me, because certain movements, like I feel like I definitely want to try to improve my strength on, like deadlifting, because I use it in jiu-jitsu, that kind of movement, like picking people up. Man, squatting, it's not my knees actually that are bothering me these days. It's my hips. So yeah. So heavy squatting, man, it may just be something I'm just not able to do to the level that I would like be wanting to do it. So I don't know. Maybe I might do something different for the squatting portion, like maybe the leg press. I personally found feeling way better with the leg press, like than just traditional squatting. And I mean, I'll squat, but I can't really do like, super heavy on squats anymore, I feel like.
Bryan, I just had another question because I was looking back through the programming doc, and this cycle we're squatting twice a week. And I feel like that's something like, especially back in CrossFit, I feel like there's so many strength cycles we would follow back in the day. And sometimes you would be squatting 3 times and be like, yo, we're going to squat
every day.
Yeah, like 4 times a week, like every day. Right. But do you want to get into what would be like the benefit of squatting multiple times a week?
Yeah, the main benefit of multiple squat sessions a week is neurological conditioning. It's just practicing something that you want to get better at. And so doing it more often makes you better. The way that this second day is programmed, though, is it's similar to prior cycles. So those that were with us for prior strength cycles will know this or remember this. But the second day is done at much lighter loads, or if not lighter loads, rather, further from failure. So they're done in what we call like speed reps. So for example, I think in the first week, we are doing a set of 6 reps in the first squat day. And this is like our intro week 1 or whatever. So we're doing a set of 6 reps with about a 10 rep max weight, meaning that there's 4 reps from failure, right? And then we're going to take that same 10 rep max weight. And on the second squat day, I think we're doing triples with it. If you have the programming in front, you can probably confirm that. But I think we're doing 4 sets of 3. 4 sets of 3 with a 10 rep max weight is 7 reps from failure, essentially. I mean, even if they get harder set to set, maybe you finish at 5 reps from failure and start at 7 reps from failure. The purpose of that is keep fatigue super low, which we now know is like a huge reason of why we want to train further from failure, right? Second, we want to hammer perfect, impeccable technique again, further from failure seems to fit that bucket pretty well. Third, we want to try to accelerate the load as fast as we possibly can. And this isn't to say that we're not trying to do that all the time, because that in a strength cycle, it's called maximal concentric intent. It basically means lift the shit as fast as you can. When you're trying to do this with lighter weights or sets that are further from failure, you actually can lift the weight fast. When you're doing sets on the Monday squat training, oftentimes you're going to be trying to lift it fast, but it's going to move slow. The Thursday squatting is all about moving the weight fast, trying to move it fast, and then also moving it fast. And so that, I think, is probably the best benefit, is instilling that desire to just move shit as quickly as you can. Because oftentimes when we get to the heavier weights on Mondays, we feel the heavy weight on our back and we're just already doubting ourselves, and we go down and then we're like, oh, it's going to be such a grind. And like, maybe we only put 90% of our effort into lifting it up, and we need to instill that maximal concentric intent that we're trying to literally jump the weight off the ground with so much explosiveness. And so that second day really hammers that pathway super well.
To kind of give a preview of the movements we're going to see this cycle, there is barbell back squat with the low bar position. We've got barbell hip thrust. We have tons of machine leg extension and leg curls. We have barbell bench press, strict barbell pen lay row, steep incline anterior delt press, strict pull-ups, tons of accessory work. So Bryan, let's actually talk about that, because we love putting in a ton of bodybuilding accessory work. So let's talk about why we do that. But there's dumbbell lateral raises. We've got curls, push downs, more squats, conventional deadlifts. Oh, we haven't seen box or bench step ups in a minute. I'm into that. We've got reverse hyperextensions. And then we're also seeing weighted pull-ups, overhead press again, some cable work, rows. So lots of stuff that, again, we just don't normally see.
Yeah, you listed every movement from the intro week. And so as she was going through that list of stuff, the main like free weight barbell movements for the most part are the repeating movements. And then she kind of continued listing the stuff that we're seeing as accessory, which is like the leg extensions, leg curls, lateral raises, hyperextensions, and stuff like that. And so this is actually becoming a pretty popular approach now in strength programs. Like if you even look at the training of elite powerlifters, most of them are doing their specific powerlifting work in the beginning, call it parts A and B or whatever that is. And then they're doing lower fatiguing hypertrophy work in their latter sections. And the reason they're doing the hypertrophy work is to build bigger muscles, which will make them stronger and move more weight. In the past, call it 20, 30 years ago, a lot of powerlifters would do accessory work, but they would try and do it in powerlifting rep ranges. And so you would see someone do their bench press, squats, deadlifts, whatever. And then they would go and they do like 5x5 push downs. Literally, you'd see them on the cable stack. And like this was common practice. They would load the cable stack with like a 6RM and they would do like 5 sets of 5 with that weight. And you can just imagine what sort of like compensations and ridiculous technique flaws we would see in that approach. And they would literally train all of these small accessory movements in lower rep ranges, thinking that by training them in lower rep ranges, it would have more transfer to their strength work. Research has since shown that that's a flawed concept, and that the literal purpose of the accessory work is to either shore up weaknesses, which certainly has a purpose. Like, you see people do board bench presses or like block pulls or something like that. But mostly it's to just straight up do hypertrophy to build bigger muscles in a less fatiguing manner. And so that's really the way that we approach these cycles too, is that our part A and B are our big mover, strength work, lower rep ranges, stuff like that. And then we just want to keep fatigue as low as possible throughout the remainder of the session. And that doesn't mean that we're not trying to work close to failure or that we're not trying to work hard or whatever. It's just that the movements that we're choosing are not as fatiguing. So doing a leg extension and a leg curl are going to be a lot less fatiguing than doing a back squat and a deadlift, even though they're training similar muscle groups. And so that's really the approach that we're taking, is just trying to manage fatigue and choose movements that are going to accommodate the larger goal of getting stronger at those big lifts.
Well, but it helps you like look good too, right? Because it's like I remember, it's like I remember back in the day, and you'd be like, "Yo, okay, we're doing a strength cycle," and you'd be like, "Well, I'm moving heavy weight, but my body comp isn't quite my favorite right now." And then, sure enough, the strength cycle would be over. You'd go back to doing more volume, more stuff, and you'd be like, "Okay, like I'm feeling myself a little more." So it's like that's something big we've always just pushed too. Is like aside from everything you covered, it really is the best of both worlds of like, well, we can be strong and we can look good and we can kind of do it, at the same time. Of course, we can shift that priority more or less each way, but like, yes, we can have the best of both worlds.
Plus, it's just fun, man. You get that good pump, man. You come out the gym feeling swole as shit.
Feeling huge.
Yeah, it's like a nutrient partitioning thing too, because when you look at those low rep movements, I've talked to you about earlier, you're just not using a lot of carbohydrate, so you're not getting a lot of that like glycogen retention intramuscle. But then when you go into those hypertrophy based movements next, you do get a lot of that like shuttling of carbohydrate into the musculature. And so that's why I think you get that sense of like, oh, I'm feeling myself, like I'm looking good, my muscles are pumped up, Whereas if you just lifted in the 1 to 5 rep range all the time, your muscles would essentially just be flat. Not that they would be small, but they would just like kind of seem flat and appear smaller.
I think also too from a mental thing, man, like just going in and hitting like a few reps on a lift and you walk out of gym, like, did I even work out, man? Like, did I even do anything? I mean, you feel the fatigue because you probably went heavier, but like, yeah, just having a little bit more to do, just I think it makes you feel a little bit like you did some shit.
I would actually be super curious for people to keep tabs of, hey, what are your maintenance calories right now during this hypertrophy cycle? And then when we go into the strength cycle at the end of the 7 weeks, does how much food you're needing each day because your training volume has changed, does that shift any? Because usually we always kind of tell people it's like, hey, whenever a new training cycle starts and we're shifting our focus between metabolic conditioning or we're doing strength or we're doing hypertrophy, you might see your maintenance needs kind of go up or go down a little accordingly with that volume. So I that's just something I'm going to make a note, but like I'm super curious to see what that difference looks like, or even if it's still actually pretty much the same.
My hypothesis would be that we don't see much of a difference.
Yeah.
And that would just be because when you look at the literature on the amount of energy expended per day, it's like 80% of it is straight up just BMR. It's just like being alive, right? And then like 12% is NEAT, and like 6% is the process of digestion. And so what is that called? The something of feeding, the
thermic effect.
Thermic effect of feeding. And then you're left with like 2 or 3% that's based on actual energy output through exercise. And so I just like, if we're looking already at a small margin of like under 5% that's related to exercise, and then one way we're exercising is we're still working out for an hour, but we're going to be doing lower reps, or we're going to work out for an hour and we're going to do slightly higher reps. I don't think it's going to move the needle much, but it definitely is an interesting question nonetheless.
I do think it'd be worth looking at like how things change, like biofeedback, like your fatigue levels or your appetite levels or your sleep. I find, man, like if I'm doing a strength cycle, like hitting heavy lifts, I'm getting tired at the end of the day, man. We're going to sleep. Like now I know if I'm obviously overreaching and doing too much, then I have trouble sleeping. But I find that like when I'm like lifting heavier, like we're going to bed because we tired.
I will say, I want to throw out, because I was just thinking deadlifts are a very specific movement. It took me a really long time to put this together. But if you're somebody that you normally train later at night, so you're hitting the gym at 6 p.m., 7 p.m., watch how that can impact your sleep, because it's specifically lower body days. If I know that my day was busy, I'm trying to get to the gym super late, I will flip-flop my days so that I go and do an upper body day when I'm going to the gym later. Because if I go and deadlift, if I go and hip thrust and it's past like 6:30, I'm not going to be able to fall asleep at night. It's like my body is just wired. And well, no duh. It's like we just spiked that cortisol curve at a time we ideally wouldn't be. Ideally we would love that at the beginning of the day. But that would just be something I would throw out for people, is it's like if you're trying to hit leg days, try to get it in earlier in the day because it can mess with your sleeps.
Yeah, the circadian rhythm thing, like I don't think that in our evolution that we were chasing down animals at 8 p.m. at night too often.
I don't know, man. Those cheetah come after you. They're nocturnal. Hey, they're nocturnals. They're nocturnal animals.
Cheetahs are nocturnal?
No, I know, not cheetahs, but you know, you could have those nocturnal predators come after you. You got to be ready for anything. You know what I'm saying?
That's true. I mean, somebody's got to stay awake and like watch the campfire, right?
Especially since we are in a strength cycle, what advice would you kind of give those busy parents, or again, just those people that are traveling, maybe their schedule's inconsistent week to week? What routes do they kind of have this next 7 weeks in terms of, hey, I'm inconsistently working out. How should I be proceeding forward? Because I think her quote was actually like, I am feeling guilty. I'm spiraling every time I get to the gym. Like, help, SOS, right?
Yeah, I think she followed that up with something along the lines of like, can I still get results training 2 times a week even?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's a few options. To give the TLDR answer first, though, I think you can 100% make benefits 2 times a week. So to think that you can't is crazy. You absolutely can. As far as the options on how to get there, we have the 4D Physique program, which is obviously 4 days a week. So maybe not the best approach, because if you were training 2 days a week, you would essentially hit 2 days and then you'd have to roll the next 2 days over to the following week, and you'd essentially fall 7 weeks behind. I think the best approach here is to follow the 3D Physique program and just do the lower body day and the upper body day, or one of those days plus the full body day. That would be maybe if you have like goals. Say you want to really prioritize lower body strength, then maybe you do the lower body day and then 4 days later you hit the full body. And then vice versa. If your goal is to train upper body more, maybe you pick the upper body day and then the full body day. Or if it's just equal, you could do the lower body day and the upper body day and skip the full body day. But I think that just choosing 2 days and just doing those 2 days on repeat is probably the best way to go, because even with the 3D Physique program, if you roll over a day, you're going to find yourself falling behind slowly over the course of the cycle. And it's going to take you, 10 weeks to do a 7-week cycle or something like that, which is fine. I think you would still get results from that. You would just then be 3 weeks behind the calendar. And so when we're starting our metabolic hypertrophy phase, you would still be finishing up strength. So I really think the simplest and least stressful approach is just to choose 2 days that fit your goals from the 3D Physique program and just repeat those days throughout the entire 7 weeks, track those movements, progress those movements. And I think you will be surprised on how much you actually gain when you give yourself more recovery, because that's really what we're doing here is we're exchanging stress and fatigue for recovery. And by doing so, you're going to have better, higher quality sessions that don't stress you out. Which is just going to lead to a better you overall.
Well, and we have to remember, right? Like our body is a dumb muscle in terms of it doesn't know we're not doing all the work we're trying to do. Our body, again, this quote that you've been saying for years and years, our body only knows the stimulus it receives and the things that we do. And so it's like trying to detach that type A perfectionist of, hey, what is it I can consistently get done, and then commit to it and then let it be enough, because again, your body doesn't know the difference.
Yep. As long as you're providing it the tension it needs in each session to grow and get stronger, then you will grow and get stronger.
Yeah, that's helpful because I'm only hit 2 days at this point. So that's definitely helpful.
For the people that are doing the zone 2 cardio, the zone 5 cardio, can you kind of give some advice on that front in terms of navigating? Because it's definitely different to be like, oh, hey, I'm going to go for a 3-mile run or go do this. But it hits a little different when you are also ripping heavy deadlifts, heavy squats, stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't know that the advice changes a whole ton. I mean, you just have to make sure you're fueling whatever activity you do. And that's something that I've even come around more so on in the last few months since I've been ramping up my own cardio work and realizing that, hey, if I'm eating enough food, I don't lose any weight. And if I don't lose any weight, I'm not losing any strength. In fact, I'm still able to progress in the gym. And so the addition of cardio, it seems it can be a problem. It can be problematic if you're choosing a source of cardio that's bad for you. For example, if I were to run with all that eccentric loading on my knees, that would be really bad for me to try to do with a strength cycle, probably with any cycle, to be honest. But I think that's one is choosing the right modality. And then two, just making sure you're eating enough, because if you're fueling and you're eating at maintenance, then you're doing cardio. That just means you have to eat more food. And at the end of the day, your body's going to recover based on the amount of food, quality food, that you give it to repair the damage that you create. And so best practice, of course, like in our blog that we wrote about the zone 2 and zone 5 cardio, we state that, the cardio would be best done on upper body focused days, where you have a rest day before the lower body day. So in a perfect world, you do some zone 2 on a Tuesday because that's an upper body day. And then you have Wednesday as a rest day. And then Thursday, you train legs again. So that would be like a really perfect place to put cardio. If you do your zone 2 on Wednesday and you give yourself 24 hours before training Thursday, I don't really think that's a problem either. I think you might see that as a problem if you did your zone 5 work on Wednesday and then you had to train legs the following day, just due to like the actual legit muscular fatigue that occurs during sprint level efforts. Regardless of modality, whether you're running, biking, rowing, it doesn't matter. You're going to be really taxing the muscular structure of your lower body in most cases. Not to mention the autonomic stress that's associated with taking your heart rate up to like 170, 175, 180, whatever your like kind of peak heart rate zone is. And so I think that I've found myself veering away from the really, really high intensity zone 5 intervals and more doing longer intervals at zone 4. And so maybe this is something that I'll write another blog about or update the current one. But I find myself leaning much more on 5 minute, like a 5x5 is what it's called. Basically 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off for 5 rounds. It's actually 3 to 5 rounds. So I would start with 3 rounds, and then the next week I would do 4 rounds. The next week I would do 5 rounds, and then I would go back to 3 rounds, but try and work harder. So it kind of follows a similar like wave loading model that you might see in hypertrophy. But I find myself with those like 3 to 6 minute intervals, I'm not actually reaching that like super peak, like 180 heart rate. I'm more just staying at like 155 to 165. And those are much easier to recover from, especially from like an autonomic nervous system. So my overall advice there at the end of that would just be stick mostly to zone 2 stuff during the strength cycle, unless you know that you're going to have a day or two off before training again. Then maybe you can hit a zone 5 workout in there. But I think getting 2 zone 2 workouts, you have a lot more freedom on where you place those, and then having that not have a negative impact on your actual training.
Another awesome episode, Bryan. Did it again.
Glad to be here.
Well, y'all, we will plug more details at the end of the podcast regarding the new cycle, but party will be starting July 10th. Come get strong with us. And that's all we got for this week.
Thanks, Bryan.
Peace, y'all.